Welcome.
This is the VALIS Podcast. This is the VALIS Podcast.
Hi and welcome to the VALIS Podcast. I'm Stu, I'm an ex-librarian. Phil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Phil Rigby. I do music and I do art and I've got a point of view.
Great stuff. So, I thought it was appropriate, considering we've named the podcast VALIS, that we'd talk about Philip K. Dick in the first episode. And naming it VALIS was kind of it was like a continuation, considering we've both been involved in a project named after a Philip K. Dick book in the past. Going back to what you said about music, was Ubik, the band night and label that we did for a bit.
Yeah.
Would you tell us a bit about why you think Philip K. Dick's worth talking about?
Yeah, sure. As well as being sci-fi schlocky novel kind of writer, which there's ample bits of, which is always good fun. He seems to be somebody who regularly gets refreshed through different media, where sort of a film will come out every sort of 5 or 6 years that seems to kind of reinvigorate interest. And I think that pattern is probably because of the fact that he was so visionary in a lot of the ideas that he came out with, and a lot of his concerns as a writer and an artist reflect concerns that we're still trying to work through in contemporary society. So things, obviously we'll get into these more deeply as we go on, but things like identity and authenticity and significance and what to believe and what you can't believe. So in the current catchphrase of fake news seems to be one that's echoing ideas that Philip K. Dick was writing about, sort of during the late 50s, early 60s and throughout the 70s. So it strikes me as worthwhile kind of reviewing his contribution.
Sounds good. I'd echo all that completely. I think while he may not be the most literary of figures in language use, he certainly had his fair share of ideas. And I think in a pretty short space of time, he churned out 44 novels. I think it was a couple of hundred short stories, and there's more ideas in 2 of his novels than there are in the complete works of some other authors.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of write him off as a bit of a gimmick writer, I think, if you're not willing to kind of let yourself get lost in the worlds that he creates, because whilst they do suffer from time to time for his style of writing, and I don't mean that as in what ends up on the page, but his actual habits as a writer and the pressures that he was under in terms of, getting paid by the word kind of thing. It's there's a lot of good stuff in there.
When I was looking earlier, what he wrote and the timescales and things. 1963, there were 5 novels. He wrote 5 novels, and that's 5 good novels as well.
Which ones were they?
Dr. Blood Money, Game Players of Titan, The Simulacra, The Crack in Space, and Now Wait for Last Year.
Okay.
So kind of just before he hit his peak, I would say, or started writing at the highest level, but still. 5 novels in a year is impressive work.
Just sheer kind of craftsmanship and knocking it out. It's he's a bit of a journeyman writer, isn't he?
Well, I should have looked at the same time to see how many short stories he wrote. I don't know whether it was a case of him writing more short stories early and then they dropped off as he started writing more novels. Be interesting to look at. I'm less
familiar with his short story stuff because I think I decided to start right at the beginning with that, and it's I must admit his earlier stuff is not my favourite stuff. I find it a little bit hard to get through some of that, but he seems to have been knocking them out at a similar kind of rate.
Yeah, the short stories are an odd thing. I think a lot of them are more conventionally science fiction compared to what his novels turned into as time went on. So I think they reveal their weakness. They're a bit like, I can't remember the name. You remember the 2000 AD comic strip where the one-shots? That's it, Future Shocks.
Well, I was just about to say that, so about 10 years ago I had a spell of writing some comics. I was writing for a small press called Future Quake, which was all based on that Future Shock 5 pages, twist at the end format. One of the things that all the writers kind of recommend that you do is to just read as much as you can. And so obviously it had to be sci-fi, so I powered through as much schlocky sci-fi as I could get my hands on, following the advice of Richard Matheson, is it, who wrote I Am Legend and Incredible Shrinking Man and stuff. And he tells a story where he always recommended going watching bad films rather than going watching good films, because if you watch a good film, you completely forget all the stuff that you're watching because you're completely engrossed in it. Whereas if you're watching a bad film, you can nick left, right, and centre because you'll think, oh, I could have done so much better with that, or I would never do that kind of idea, or that's a great idea. Why have they completely squandered it on this piece of crap film? So I powered through quite a lot of 50s and 60s and early 70s science fiction novels, like the 180-page type stuff, or corgi British press type things. So it's sort of familiar with that trashy hack mentality of writing books, of just knocking them out as quick as they can, because they got paid by the word, and that's the only way you could make your money. And Philip K. Dick starts off in that genre, doesn't he? Well, pretty much ploughed that for quite a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I've got to admit my weakness here. Well, I don't know whether it's a weakness. I don't particularly like most science fiction novels. I've tried them at various different points. It's almost only Philip K. Dick that grabs me in the field.
You must have read Vonnegut.
Yeah, I've read Vonnegut. Again, he's not exactly straight sci-fi, is he?
Well, he refused the mantle of sci-fi writer, didn't he?
Yeah, well, he's too interesting.
And interestingly, Philip K. Dick actually slags off Vonnegut, doesn't he?
Does he?
Have you heard that? Yeah, there's an interview. It's quite funny where he gets quite angry about him. And I totally get where he's coming from as well, but he's just like, he sucks the sap of life out of you when you read it. And I must admit, whilst I do like Vonnegut, I find his endings the most depressing endings of any books that I've come across. I'm trying to think. See, Cat's Cradle, where the guy gets frozen at the end. It just made me feel so bleak.
Spoiler alert. He's kind of like a bit. He's got a bit of Thomas Pynchon about him, I think. It's like
Vonnegut.
yeah. You'll have like hijinks all the way through, and then all of a sudden, like, it's entropy and people disappearing into the landscape.
Well, I think all three of them are like sort of quintessential postmodern writers, really, aren't they? If you want to talk well, that's the phrase of the moment, isn't it? In terms of which camp are you in?
Yeah, these damn postmodernists.
Yeah.
Breaking our toys.
Well, it's they at the same time. Whilst I think, because I think there are three writers that are good to compare to each other. I think Dick and Pynchon and Vonnegut are all kind of playing with similar ideas. But out of the three of them, there's only Dick who's optimistic. There's always a sense of optimism about his stuff, in the way that Vonnegut's stuff is incredibly pessimistic, I think. And Pynchon, although you're probably better read on Pynchon than I am, but I don't get that same sense of hope. Like there is something to hope for.
Well, I think in a way, Philip K. Dick was really trying hard to be successful. I mean, the other two, I think. I mean, I might be far off on this, but they were writing very serious, what they considered to be very serious literature, and I would assume that if you're aiming to write very serious literature, that you're not really probably aiming simultaneously at great commercial popularity.
Yeah,
they're not exactly compatible, are they, in many cases? But Philip K. Dick really wanted his novels to be popular. He went through a period of writing, was it 5 or 6 of what he called mainstream novels in a row, trying to get that breakthrough.
It's my confession that I've not read any of his serious stuff. I've only read the sci-fi stuff.
They're remarkably similar to the sci-fi things, but just without the robots. And more. I've read 2. Sorry, what was that?
You've already turned me off, though. No?
Yeah. they're like it. I think they reveal a side of his character which is not the most engaging or pleasant to look at. There's a lot of sort of Freudian terror underlying somebody going and filling the washing machine up or something.
Well, that taps into another sort of key trope for him, which was mental health or mental illness and neuroticism and psychosis, which litters his stuff, doesn't it? And it's which is kind of used as a metaphor, isn't it, for what you can believe in, that hallucinatory kind of experience, and whether it's possible to actually believe the things that you're seeing or experiencing.
Mm-hmm. How did you first come across Philip K. Dick?
The first book that I tried to read was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was following on from being blown away by Blade Runner, and that was a shocking experience because obviously it's nothing like Blade Runner at all. It's like Blade Runner's this highly aesthetically pleasing kind of sci-fi cyberpunk movie, and the book itself is about keeping up with the Joneses, isn't it? It's about his kind of him twitching the curtains and looking at his neighbour's sheep and trying to work out whether it's real or not, and the kind of social pressures that come with that. So that was quite an anticlimactic experience, really, for my introduction to Philip K. Dick, and it was only a few years later when somebody described Scanner Darkly to me, the plot line of that kind of caught my imagination, and I thought, oh well, I'll give that a read, and that was the start, really. And once I'd read Scanner Darkly, picked on a few more. And I think Ubik was probably the one that sort of got me really excited about just the fact that it's they're a bit like The Fall, aren't they? Always different, always the same, the novels. It's the same kind of themes that he's got bubbling away in the background, but he's got a great sort of palette of different gimmicks that he drops on, whether it's people with psychic powers who can look into the future, or whether it's creating robots and androids, or whether it's star travel or something more supernatural than that. He's got a really good vocabulary of those kind of MacGuffin type ideas that can that just keep it interesting. But he essentially is exploring the same themes over and over again.
Obviously, a lot of science fiction stuff has these slightly changing and shifting arrangements of teleportation devices or flying cars, or these different things that are introduced in the flapples, I think he calls them, doesn't he? Flapples. But the thing that gets me is the metaphysical system that he places just underneath the surface of each of his novels, and these get more sophisticated as time goes on, and as he starts writing his later novels. So, first of all, the first thing you see are the flying cars and the laser guns and the different plot devices that he puts in. But when you dig slightly deeper, you find these really, really interesting philosophical.
Well, he was one of the first of the of what became that sort of I'm trying to remember, the new wave of of science fiction writers, because up until that point the vast majority of sci-fi that was coming out was cowboys in space. It was essentially people running around with laser guns fighting baddies on a planet somewhere, and or space opera. That was the other sort of opportunity with the sort of Star Wars kind of genre of things. And what he was one of the initial kind of proponents of was exploring inner space rather than outer space, which when I was going through that process of just ploughing through loads and loads of different sci-fi novels, essentially just on the lift to try and get ideas for doing stuff, you quickly realise that he's much more interested, less in the sort of the gimmicks of lasers and robots and things like that, as into how people respond to those types of things, and how you can exaggerate the human experience. And that's one of the really surprising things about Dick's novels when you're reading them, is how human they are. They're much more human than any of the other kind of writers at the time, because they tend to have very neurotic characters in them, who are worried about embarrassing themselves and doing something daft, or who have very particular kind of hang-ups about things. And you see his interest in psychiatry and psychology kind of come through there. But it's like you say, it's also these kind of more metaphysical concerns of an existential kind of nature, of what the point of it all is, and whether you can trust your sensory perception in these different kinds of environments. So, and that's especially in the early days, that's what sets him apart. Because even in those earlier novels, you can feel those themes coming through. The fact that that's what he's interested in a way that you don't get. So, like, I'm trying to think of some other. Who's the guy who did Starship Troopers? The name will come back to me. But his characters, it's like men are men and women are women kind of thing, and there doesn't need to be, or like Arthur C. Clarke, where every man's like almost like an Ayn Rand sort of engineer who will master the world and solve the problems and achieve great things, and that's not the set of characters that appear in Dick's novels.
No, they're usually, they're quite often downtrodden, quite often working men,
skilled manual labourers normally, aren't they?
That's what I was looking for. Repairmen and things, and sort of pursuing the project of finding meaning in what they're doing, which, as you just pointed out, isn't the common science fiction trope, is it? It's usually it's hero dynamics.
Well, it's become much more prevalent, or it becomes much more prevalent after that era, where you've got, because other people start to pick it up, and certainly when you get into the 70s, it's become one of the more dominant kind of tropes within science fiction, because you've got the psychedelia and the kind of spirituality of the 60s, and the interest in psychology. So you've got other writers like Delaney and people like that who are playing around with things like archetypes and psychology and Jungian kind of mythology sort of cropping up and that type of thing. Or Ballard, even from Britain, who's one of my favourites, who is very much about, it's more what's going on in the heads rather than what's going on in the world. But then you get the best of both worlds with Dick, don't you? Because it's not only that psychology and or corrupted psychology of the neurotic or the psychotic, but you've then got this expansive sense of, it's not just reality, it's what's past reality as well, which plays into a lot of his. There's not very many religious sci-fi writers out there. And that's certainly one of his unique selling points, isn't it, as a writer?
He seems to have an insatiable hunger for knowing. Going back to how I came across Philip K. Dick, I started sort of scattershot. I think it was probably Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep that I read first. As I've got a paperback that I seem to remember picking up in HMV for £3, which I burnt through, and then started going in all directions outwards. I didn't really know much about the guy, but just picking up paperbacks whenever I could. And it ended up leading to a bit of a collection of going on Amazon on the second-hand market and trying to find the most gaudy paperbacks of the novels as I can for a penny each.
Absolutely, yeah.
Buying them up. And I just burnt through them. But it wasn't really until I'd got to the sort of the later novels that I'd say I became enamoured. And that's where my interest kind of really focuses, with the books around VALIS. Hence the name of the podcast. And
yeah.
I just finished reading VALIS again for must be like 10th, 15th time, something like that.
Right.
And I get something new out of it every time I read it. This time it struck me how it's just a parade of possible explanations for something, and then undermining those sets of ideas and introducing another one to test them on to see how they imprint on experience. I'll just mention briefly, because I wouldn't imagine that many people know. So Philip K. Dick claimed that he had been hit, is it 1972, I think it is, that he was hit by a
experience.
Sorry?
His experience.
Yeah, that he was hit by a beam of pink light and had massive amounts of information passed to his brain, including information regarding the diagnosis of a potentially deadly illness that his son had.
Yeah, have you seen the Robert Crumb comic of it?
No, I haven't.
Robert Crumb drew a comic which was called something like The Experience of Philip K. Dick, and it essentially retells the story of him. Like you say, his son wasn't very well, and they were expecting medication to be delivered, and there was a knock at the door, and he opens the door, and the woman who answers, who's bringing this medication, has got the Christian fish symbol hanging around her neck. And I'm trying to remember this properly now, but there was something about that triggered this experience that he has.
It's in VALIS. It's presented as he's had impacted wisdom tooth, so he's in extreme pain, and also he's taken a drug which he points out is called the truth drug, and then when he opens the door and sees the fish, one of the possibilities he offers is it's a secret symbol which was designed not for him, but for another version of him that existed at the time of Christ. And with the sign of the early Christians, that would trigger a recognition and enable them to have their secret meeting. But because he's so open due to the pain and the drugs, he receives it and then becomes aware of himself and himself in the future and himself in the past, because the empire never ended and time doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And I think that brings us on to the themes of Gnosticism. Maybe we could jump into that.
Yeah. I was just thinking. I actually watched last night a clip from when he was doing that science fiction festival in Paris, and he does the press conference. Because the first time that I watched that, it was quite uncomfortable viewing, but the more that I've watched it, and certainly the context of what I was watching last night, they were talking about the Mandela effect. I don't know if you're aware of this, as in Philip K. Dick being one of the first people to identify the Mandela effect, and this like a modern symptom of feeling like the whole world has changed kind of overnight. So you remember the bit in Time at a Joint where he goes into the bathroom and he reaches for the light switch, where he automatically goes for it every time and it's not there, it's on the opposite side of the room. This feeling that things have changed. And he there's a line that he says in that press conference about being the first person not to have experienced an alternative past or an alternative future, but an alternative present, which is all the way through VALIS, isn't it? It's this idea, that whole thing about the empire never ended, and that there is variables being changed on the outside, but that people just automatically don't remember. But it gets the name from Nelson Mandela, who everybody kind of, certainly the generation that remembers Free Nelson Mandela, it was about Nelson Mandela dying in prison and the fact that he needed to be released because he was dying. And then obviously when he was released, he didn't die for quite a long time. And it was like this kind of, well, Why does nobody talk about that? That was, and it's that idea of, something shifted, and that's another one of those things that's very Dickian in the way that you kind of describe bureaucracies being Kafkaesque. There's a nuanced Dickian kind of thing, and I think an alternative present is a good way of thinking about it. But
I think it's something that genuinely, I mean, I've definitely experienced it multiple times in my life. I'll say this directly. I had an experience walking down Oxford Road in Manchester. There's a bridge that goes over the canal, and I was walking over that. At one point, something triggered in my brain with the sight of the wall, and I could taste blood in my mouth, and I had the sensation as if I had experienced like falling and maybe knocking my teeth against the wall, and I've never had such a vivid experience of something that wasn't tangibly real.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you've done the same. You've gone to step up a step, and the step isn't there.
Yeah.
And you can bodily, you can feel.
Yeah,
that it should be.
It's kind of akin to deja vu or something like that, isn't it? I'm trying to remember the bit out of the Robert Anton Wilson Illuminatus trilogy where he comes up with lots of different views. There's deja vu and other ones where you remember things that haven't happened yet, or you remember things. And there's some interesting psychological phenomena at play there, but like you say, it's this sensation of, or certainly what Dick's trying to get at, is this sensation of there being other present moments that are just kind of next to you, whether it's the Roman Empire that never ended, or whether it's a complete kind of matrix idea of your whole world is completely at the beck and call of some other force, whether it's malevolent or not, which is kind of where the Gnosticism thing comes into it, isn't it? Because it's an interesting twist on that whole idea that maybe the thing that's behind the reality is malevolent, but maybe there's something else behind that that's trying to help you out, and it's like these layers of reality that he kind of plays around with, isn't it? Which is that Gnostic idea of the demiurge and the creator.
Would you give us a brief account of the Gnostic idea of the demiurge? And
well, as I understand it, because we've debated this a few times, but as I understand it, there is, well, it's based on an old heresy, which is the God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. I think that's the easiest way of understanding it. And obviously the God of the Old Testament is the creator God. And the God of the New Testament is the God of love and Jesus coming down as a Messiah, Saviour, Redeemer kind of character. And the Gnostics thought that the God of the Old Testament, because it had brought the material universe into play, that was the big problem, that it was the material universe that was the problem. And the spark of the divine that exists within people knows where it comes from, and it's trying to get back to that divine world, which I can't, the name of which escapes me at the moment. But so they have some slightly different terminology. So the creator God, the Yahweh God, if you like, of the Old Testament is what they call the demiurge, which is the creator God, who is I don't know how you describe him as malicious, but it's certainly not the kind of divine, true God that the Gnostics would have worshipped, who kind of sits behind that. I'm not described that very well, but it's just this idea of layers of reality, isn't it? And the fact that there is that it's, and again it taps into this hope thing, that there is an opportunity to pierce through that and to get back to some perfect state, which I think kind of leans on your mate Plato's ideas. Mm-hmm. So as I understand it, it was one of the early Christian heresies, and we we've the only through things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and certain other libraries that have been found through archaeology over time, we pieced together this set of beliefs that set them apart from what became Orthodox Christianity.
I can't remember the name of that guy, but I was watching a video that you recommended to me the other day about somebody talking about the Gospels, the Lost Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels. Is it the Gospel of Judas? Which
I think that's the main Gnostic text.
Yeah, that kind of presents this idea that I thought it was absolutely fascinating. One of the meals that the disciples were having with Jesus, that Jesus said to the disciples, "You don't actually know the truth.
Yeah.
If you've got an inkling, step forward and tell me." And Judas steps forward and says, "I think I know something." And what he says is basically along the lines of, "You are not of God."
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, as you just said, that Jesus isn't part of the Creator God at all. Jesus is part of another God that's higher, that's taken pity on us, and he's attempting to come down and interject on humanity's behalf. Yeah,
because they had this idea that Sophia, I think, is quite an important thing for them, is it, as knowledge, but as a female, actual feminine character that comes out of this perfect world, and when she exists outside of that, gives birth to other entities, one of which is this creator God, isn't it? So it's the other thing that I thought was interesting in that video clip that I sent you. It's Bert D. Ehrman. Is the scholar. Who's great. He's an expert on Gnostic stuff, and he's a scholar on the New Testament basically, and that's his area of expertise. And but they were so adamant that the God of the Old Testament wasn't the true God, that anything that was kind of prescribed in the Old Testament, they felt that they should do the opposite, just to kind of position that make it identifiable that they weren't following that God. So which led to some wrong behaviour.
Well, I can imagine that got them a few devotees.
I'd be interested.
As a sort of final point on that, I think, again, going back to VALIS, because it's so fresh in my mind, he really explores some interesting consequences of that idea and expands. It's not just Jesus that is that has come down to try and pass on messages, but pretty much every prophet throughout time from every religion is considered also. So, like the Buddha is in the park. Asclepius, another figure that he identifies as the saviour, come down to give us information, and then tragically in VALIS, a 2-year-old child born of a insane rock star, who's presented as the saviour, and unfortunately doesn't last long. Again, I think going back to what you said earlier regarding hope, there's always streams of hope running through Philip K. Dick's work, but there's also acceptance of chains of causation that run alongside, and that's sort of you've got the material aspects from the mad God, which is the chain of causation and the inevitable happenings that you can't control, but then you have this massive variety of different possible sources of hope in a metaphysical way that he used to draw from. You get the feeling that he liked his Encyclopedia Britannica, Philip K. Dick, and liked to have a good search through any piece of reference material he could find for an interesting bit of possible metaphysics to incorporate into his worldview and his thinking.
Yeah, he's one of those. He's a very well-read writer, isn't he? Mm-hmm. In terms of where he pulls his influences from, and he was obviously. I think in his younger days, he's worked his way through a lot of science fiction stuff, where he gets his kind of back catalogue of gimmicks from. although he adds to that as well. But much because another writer it's good to kind of compare him to is William S. Burroughs, who writes there's some similarities in the way that they use science fiction to talk about other things. But as he started to get his stuff published, I think it becomes evident that he's pulling his literary influences from a much deeper vein than just the kind of hacky sci-fi short stories, the kind of John Campbell stuff in the world. And much like it's something that we're probably not going to have time to talk about, but his absolute love of classical and concert music, which is again peppers throughout his books. He talks about different pieces, and in fact the title of "Flow My Tears," the policeman said, is a rework of a John Dolan song. "Flow My Tears."
I did not know that.
That was his favourite song. Yeah, which is I think it's Elizabethan, isn't it? Isn't it one of the madrigal sort of composers?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, but that's another one of those things because it's one of those bits that tends to get missed in the conversation with about Dick. As does humour, which is, so like I've always found that quite frustrating in the adaptations of his stuff. The fact that the humour, which runs all the way through his stuff, and it's really, really laugh out loud funny type stuff, just seems to get missed. As in, no, that's not important, but that's one of those things that makes it the neurosis, the love of music, the humour are all those things that none of the other writers were bringing out at the time, and it's what makes his characters so interesting. Although they do tend to be the same character throughout each story.
Yeah. On that note, let's talk a little bit about the archetypal characters that he used and the tropes, because there is only a handful, really.
Yeah.
You've got the I'd say the vast majority of cases, the male character is slightly dissatisfied, slightly mediocre man attempting to find meaning, and usually under the influence of one of two archetypes of a woman.
Yeah.
Usually tyrannical and shrill and overbearing.
Yeah.
Or beautiful and appealing and in need of saving.
His archetype of that first female character, the dark-haired woman that he normally refers to, because he actually had a collection of short stories called The Dark-Haired Woman. But it's also that character who tells him that there's another reality, but also that he's right, that there's another reality. This kind of confirmation and validation of his suspicions and paranoia. Because I seem to remember that the woman who comes to his door when he has his experience has got dark hair as well. So that all kind of compounds his thinking around whether it's a psychotic or delusional or blessed vision of what's going on or whatever, but it certainly seems to tie together.
So that's the female character that the main character usually encounters at some point, and ends up getting involved with, whether not always romantically, but gets involved with. But the figure of the wife or the girlfriend is not sympathetic at all. I mean, if you look at the wife character in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, she's sort of, I'd say she'll do as a summary for the rest. She's pressurizing him into doing nothing but earning money and bringing money home so that they can keep up appearances. Does she even know that they're the animal that they have? Yes, she does know that it's an electric animal rather than a real one, doesn't she? But it's her pressure that's that's putting the pressure on him to continue in his dangerous line of work so that they can get enough money together so that they can buy an animal and gain status.
That's right. Yeah. Which is all a reflection of his first marriage, isn't it? He was quite unsuccessful, I think, in his romantic encounters, and certainly his first marriage seems to have got very unhappy very quickly, and where there was a lot of pressure for him to earn money, which is not that easy to do when your only way of earning money is, other than working in a record shop, and some of the other sob stories that he used to tell about eating dog food and things like that. I don't know if you're aware of those, but was just constantly knocking out these novels. And although looking back, some of them have got some really very clever ideas going on in them. Some of the earlier ones I find quite difficult to read just because it's. I find this is a strange compliment, but I find it difficult to read in the same way that I find someone like Dickens or Dostoevsky quite difficult to read. But those writers who were knocking things out to be read in sections that were published in a newspaper or something like that, because it tends to lead to a style that I don't find very natural to read. It's like quite arbitrary sort of breaks, and the timing seems to become a bit forced and stilted, doesn't it?
With constant peaks. No let up, just constant peak drop, peak drop, peak drop, peak drop. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I find it almost impossible to read Dickens for that very reason.
I'm glad you said that. Makes me feel bad.
Well, I mean, I'd say it's worth reading one or two, but no more than that. I think you got the idea.
Get away with not reading any.
But things like the Pickwick Papers. I mean, it's great. It's great to pick up and read it, but you only need to read the first quarter, because the rest of it is exactly the same as what you've just read, repeated over and over again, depending on how many issues they wanted to pay him for. Yeah. Which it highlights the problem, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you get a similar thing in comics, because one of my favourite comic writers, who's been quite heavily criticised for plagiarising people like Dick and Michael Moorcock and that, is Grant Morrison. And so you've got two markets basically for comics, which is those people who'll buy them on a weekly basis, and those people who wait for the trade paperback to come out, where they collect sort of chunks of the story. And because he is where his career is, he tends to get criticised for writing comics that are going to end up in trade paperbacks. So you can buy, and like nothing happens one week, basically because he's just setting things up. And you get the weekly comic writers, comic readers who want a peek in the middle of the story. So it's one of those quirks of the medium, isn't it?
And it's just a little bit too utilitarian for me. I don't find it in the slightest appealing. I was talking to Claire the other night about novels, and she was saying she wanted to read something. She was looking on the Kindle to buy a new book, but she didn't want something that was a trilogy or had got endless sequels, because everything you pick up is bloody
franchise. Milk the franchise.
That's it. Establishing a franchise.
Yeah.
Getting a nice little routine, and it's totally unsatisfying. I'd much rather read one book and then put it down and then move on to something else.
Yeah.
But
Manchurian Candidate 2.
I'm sorry?
Manchurian Candidate 2. So some films are just good, and books are good just because of that standalone kind of,
Yes. I've got down here as a talking point we thought about that Philip K. Dick was an author of ideas. What do you make of that?
Well, it goes back to the earlier thing, doesn't it? About there's always, even in one of his crap books, there's always at least 4 or 5 really kind of standout good ideas, even in his worst novels, with the possible exception of Deus Irae, which I don't think has any redeeming factors whatsoever. But I don't think he takes the whole blame for that, does he? But I think even in even in books that I haven't particularly enjoyed the experience of reading, there's always been a few things where I've thought, oh, that's a really good idea. Do you know what I mean? So there's that gimmicky kind of thing. Well, I was just about to say, some of the books have really surprised me, because at one point I was having a competition with a friend of mine to try and get through the entire canon of Philip K. Dick. And so I was reading some of the more obscure stuff. Like, I don't know if you've read The Zap Gun.
No, that's one of the ones that I haven't read.
It's fantastic. Really, really good. And that's one of the problems that you get with prolific writers. It's not a problem, but there's loads of these hidden gems. And it's a bit like punk or dance music, isn't it? Where it kind of, there's so much of it. You've really got to wade through it. But it's worthwhile wading through some of the below average stuff, because of the moments that you're going to get with the great book like that.
The only reason I haven't read The Zap Gun is because I thought, because of the title, that it was going to be like early 50s. It's
one of his trippy ones.
Yeah, it's early to mid 60s, 1964. Yeah. So that alongside Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch and The Penultimate Truth.
Well, I was going to say, is it after Three Stigmata?
Yeah, the one after.
Right, because Three Stigmata, if memory serves, that's the one where he kind of got a reputation as a druggy author, as like an acid type author.
That's right.
And all the stories about him writing on acid and stuff like that started to circulate, which were obviously bollocks. But the Zap Gun surprised me for that, because it's got some really hallucinatory moments in it, which is no mean feat to get across writing prose. But Three Stigmata is one of my favourites, and it's. I think he spins a number of plates in that book. He spins the whole kind of religious elements really neatly, and he's got the whole. The humour is all the way through with his candy and
choosy.
Oh, yeah. And he's playing around with stuff like that, there's one of the things that I found quite interesting is he plays between the dynamic of escapism and a religious sense of there being another reality, and because they're escaping into that other reality, aren't they, with Perky Pie? Because they're like playing with dolls or something on drugs, aren't they? And
that's it.
Like, collect the whole set kind of thing.
That's it. They create a doll's house with the mail order parts, and then they have to take the drug, and then they can sort of enter the world.
That's right. Yeah, and it's like The Sims or something like that, isn't it? But it's much more immersive.
Yes, it's like Second Life.
Yeah,
like the MMO sort of things that they've had going for a few years now.
Yeah, and but in parallel to that, you've got these kind of religious themes as well playing around. So most, especially Christian religions, are based on this idea of there being somewhere else to go to, or this idea of there being somewhere else to go to. And it being because they escape into the Perky Pat world because they're all. So the workers essentially on an oil rig kind of existence, isn't it? They're on a moon somewhere, I think.
Yeah, they're on another planet, so they're in domes, and then they're just attempting to grow plants. Yeah,
so it's a pretty horrendous existence, isn't it? And that's their escape out of it. So I just thought that juxtaposition was quite a neat play with it. But it's very funny and it's very trippy, the book. I think it stands up a lot better than other kind of 60s stuff that's kind of suffered a bit more due to the post-punk cynicism that kind of entered our vocabulary.
There's another book around that time. I think it was slightly just before, called The Unteleported Man. Did you read that one?
You'll have to remind me of some of the early ones start merging into one.
It was released as The Unteleported Man and then later as Lies Incorporated, the released version was basically the book was cut in half. So you've got a scheme where people can go off planet to a colony, but it's a one-way teleport.
Right.
we've got no video footage of what it's like over there. We know that it's worked, but all we can do is we can send you. But to get there and back, it's 18 years in a ship to get there and 18 years back. So the main fella decides that he's going to go, but he won't go through the teleport because he wants to be able to get back, and he thinks there's something going wrong.
Right.
He thinks he perceives what's really going on. Surprise, surprise. So off he goes in his ship, and the unteleported man ends with the revelation that there is something seriously going wrong. But the full novel, that's the halfway point of the novel, and the second half is a really trippy, hallucinogenic experience of the man when he gets there.
Oh, right,
When he reaches the destination, and it's I would say it's almost it's sort of a brainstorm activity in working towards writing something like the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Right. Yeah.
But it's well worth a look.
I mean, that is another way of kind of reading his stuff as well, isn't it? In terms of his exegesis and the more familiar you become with his stories and his themes and what interested him as a person, the more it appears like him trying to work out what is going on in the world through writing these wacky, crazy stories.
Can I just jump in there a second? Just to say what the exegesis is. So he had this experience of the pink beam of light, and there were many, many other things I won't go into now that happened to him, or he claims have happened to him as a result of that experience. And he started writing a journal, which he termed his tractate or his exegesis, and it ran to thousands of pages. It's actually now been for a couple of times excerpts have been released. At the back of VALIS, there's about 5 pages worth of excerpts from it, and then I believe in the 90s there was a slim book which contained a few excerpts from it, and then I don't know, maybe in the last 10 years there was a decent publishing job where around a tenth of it is published, selected to be actually readable, and I, with great enthusiasm, went out and bought it on the day of release, and I've probably spent about 30 or 40 hours with it or so, and got through about 100 pages, and it's gone back on the shelf, and I've not looked at it since. But the material that he worked on in the exegesis then cropped up in VALIS, in the Radio Free Albemuth, in the Divine Invasion, in a little bit in Transmigration of Timothy Archer, and it's pretty much the constant in all of his late work. But also, if you look carefully at some of the stuff that he wrote before, all the themes are there. They're all there waiting to be plucked.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that we've not talked about was his very early days, because he was a twin, wasn't he? And but the other child died when his mum was giving birth, and he had this obsession about his twin who was dead, which kind of comes out in books like Ubik, with this idea of being able to communicate with the other side. And then it's only a small step from there being another side to there being another reality. And it's very Alice through the looking glass kind of mentality, isn't it? And then his attraction to ideas like Gnosticism, and his attraction to if not the actual experience, but the idea of taking hallucinatory drugs and experiencing the same world in a different way that other people weren't experiencing it. And then these Mandela time at a joint light switch type moments of where it kind of reinforces this idea that the reality that you perceive isn't perhaps the grand reality, and there's other things to get into. But there's a sense to why he's attacking this idea over and over again, isn't there?
Why he's making the claims that he's making.
Yeah.
And
So
and
they're
also
not quite as ridiculous as they appear on first reading.
also with the idea of the twin is also the idea that crops up throughout his books constantly of somebody needing saving, but who can't be saved. And lost through that. It's the same with Elvis, isn't it? With the twin that apparently he used to sit and talk to and ask questions of.
Right.
I find it quite haunting. It's
a bit macabre, isn't it? The whole situation.
Makes me think of the Scott Walker song. Jesse, are you listening?
You're a Scott Walker fan, man, and I don't mind him, but I'm not as well listened as you are. As well.
Not an obsessive.
Your words, not mine.
Like myself. Right, Phil, we're coming up to an hour on that, so I think it's probably a good place to put a pause on it.
No worries.
Thanks anybody who listens to this. If you do find it interesting, leave us a comment. Let us know how you take it. And we'll be following this up with another episode fairly soon. In fact, just before we go, it might be worth us saying the idea behind this podcast, or that I had, was we would pull up a subject or a person or a musician or an artist of one form or another that we think is culturally significant and interesting, and then have a discussion about it. I chose Philip K. Dick to start with because he's somebody that I know that we're both very keen on, but I'm hoping that what we can do is we can each in turn bring up a subject where maybe one of us is a bit less informed, and we can have some interesting conversations that maybe require a little bit less knowledge in the topic going in than this particular episode. So if you've got any ideas, give us a shout as well, and we'll see what we can do with them.
That was the VALIS Podcast. That was the VALIS Podcast.